today's episode of the SSPX Podcast will continue our Apologetics Series by looking at one man in particular, Galileo Galilei. There may not be another singular person who is a source of such controversy throughout the history of the Catholic Church, and Galileo is the favorite tool that many use to claim that the Church is backwards, anti-science, anti-reason, and more. So what's the story with Galileo? And why did the Catholic Church react the way she did when Galileo was making all his amazing discoveries? You can find notes to all of these episodes at sspxpodcast.com/apologetics, as well as all of our previous episodes. There as well, you can find a link to help support this project. This is free to listen to, as well as all the resources we're posting. But if you can help with a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, you'll be making sure that we can continue this work of producing good Catholic content on a regular basis. Now let's join Dr. John Rao for episode number 25 of the Apologetics Series now. Dr. Rao, thanks for joining us on this, I think, last episode that you and I are talking about with these controversies about the Catholic Church through history. Today, we're talking about Galileo. It's another big hot button issue with people who like to say that the Catholic Church was wrong in certain cases. So can you give us a brief introduction into what the Galileo case is, and then we can kind of get into some of the specifics?
Right. Well, the Galileo case is something which involves primarily the question of whether Galileo could talk about the Copernican theory and consequences of the Copernican theory as something more than a hypothesis, because of the fact that there are, as we'll probably see if we go into greater detail, there were a lot of debates about this. There were a lot of people who had questions that proved to be very good questions, and with respect not just to the theory of Copernicus in general, but to Galileo's particular proofs for his theory. And then it emerges into something more than that because of Galileo's efforts to try to go beyond presenting this as an hypothesis, and then an effort to try to explain how Scripture had to be interpreted with respect to it. And there are a lot of specific matters here concerning pressures from the outside on the Inquisition, on the papacy, and then also just some rather personal characteristics of Galileo, which enter into the picture as well. But it has two stages. There's a stage in 1615, 1616, and then there's the other stage, which is going to reach its conclusion in the 1630s.
So I guess in a broad brush, the issue was Galileo was an astronomer. He was a scientific-minded guy. And I'm, again, painting with a very broad brush. You can fill in the details. And he wasn't the first one to come up with the idea or to come up with the hypothesis that the Earth revolved around the sun. Like you said, that had already been developed by Copernicus before him. But he was the one who, with telescopes, with this new equipment, was able to say, yeah, this actually is the truth of what is happening. The Earth is revolving around the sun. And the standard narrative is the Catholic Church said, stop, that's contradicting Scripture. We're going to haul you up in front of the Inquisition. We're going to tell you to stop teaching this because this is contrary to the Catholic faith. That is basically the attack that most people would say about the Galileo case. Where do we start to get into the details? Where do we fall short there?
Well, I mean, from the very beginning, first of all, Copernicus himself is a cleric, and there was no problem that he experienced with his theory, which does indeed overturn the whole Aristotelian and Ptolemaic argument about the different character of different parts of the universe. And then the immobility of the universe and the like. But he didn't run into any problem with proposing his arguments. In fact, he then dedicated his work to Pope Paul III in the 1530s, and again, no problems. There are very, very serious attacks on Copernicus and his theory, and then also on Tycho Brahe, who is a figure that's involved with this as well in his own particular way, by Luther and by Melanchthon. And there are many people who just simply refuse to believe it from the scientific world for a period afterwards. For example, Francis Bacon, the founder of the scientific method, never accepted it at all. Galileo was primarily a mathematician. That was his great work at the University of Padua in Italy. But as you mentioned, his reputation is really as an astronomer, basically because of the fact that he so much perfects the telescope, and then being able to perfect it, was able, again, with a famous demonstration of it to the leaders of Venice from the bell tower of San Marco. He was able to show them the value of the telescope, and then with the telescope, what he did was he contradicted the theories about the moon having a flat surface, because he could show that it had various kinds of features of it that were parallel to the Earth, and then the satellites around Jupiter, which is something that's not supposed to happen according to the old system. He was able to demonstrate things about the phases of Venus. Again, I'm not an astronomer, but I just simply know that these were all things that were not supposed to be able to be demonstrated on the basis of the geocentric theory. And he gains great renown because of all this. He already had renown from his work as a mathematician, but this is something which very much gave him a greater renown on a popular level. And he's really feted by everybody. He gets a position of importance in the court of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He goes to Rome, where he's welcomed by everybody. This is in 1611. He's welcomed by everybody. He has discussions. He becomes a member of this institute, kind of artistic scientific institute in Rome called the Lincei. He is welcomed at the Roman College of the Jesuits, and there are discussions there, but the discussions there are simply with regard to the question of the facts about what is involved in his accepting the Copernican argument, because of the fact that there are all of these debates at the time among mathematicians with respect to it. There's debates about, there's not a debate about whether what you're seeing is what you're seeing through the telescope, but whether it actually does prove the kinds of things that Galileo said that it proved. And Galileo had all sorts of ideas which were then debunked over the course of the 1600s and afterwards. I mean, he got into a battle with people over comets, which he thought were, in effect, a kind of optical illusion rather than anything else. When Kepler comes up with the argument that then Newton will perfect about the tides having some sort of being a consequence in some way of the effect of the moon and of the sun, but in an occult way. In other words, in the sense that we don't understand how. Galileo reacted very badly against this for a number of reasons, one of which is something which we might be able to come back to in a different way later, which is the tremendous influence of all kinds of occult, magical, cosmological ideas, because you're at the heyday of the magicians and the alchemists at the beginning of the 1600s. But what ends up getting him into difficulty was that not the Jesuits in Rome, but some Dominicans in Florence complained about Galileo's ideas, his Copernican argument, and said that what it did was it just simply violated the interpretation of Scripture, which was unanimously accepted by the fathers. And Trent had talked about Scripture having to be interpreted in line with the teachings of the fathers. And then what happened is that, and we're still in this, this period like 1615. So Galileo wrote a letter to a Benedictine friend of his who was shared the Copernican view about this whole question of Scripture. And he writes another longer letter to the Grand Duchess of Tuscany about the same thing. And it's here that what he argues is that, especially in the letter to the Grand Duchess, what he argues is that Scripture is meant to be, Scripture has an infallible teaching with regard to spiritual matters, but it's not meant to teach physics or mathematics, and that the argument has to be, and this is, an argument that's a common argument afterwards. The argument is on his part that what had to be seen about the statements of, let's say, statements of the writer Scripture in Joshua about the standing still has to be understood from the standpoint of the people's knowledge of science at the time, and had to be, in effect, reinterpreted in line with what people began to discover in a more recent era, right? And then this is what then causes the first discussions of the Roman Inquisition in Rome.
So, I guess before we get into some of those specific topics about what the church says versus what Galileo says, and then these discussions,
right?
To take kind of a step back and look at the context of the time. We're in the early 1600s.
Right.
We're still, the church is still in the throes of the Counter-Reformation. Trent had just happened, 40 years before. And does that have any kind of bearing on what we're doing here? Is the church being, I'm going to spoil it a little bit, but is the church being overly defensive and trying to kind of rein in things because of what they're doing at the Counter-Reformation? Or
no, in fact, the church is not in any way really reining in much of anything. Everything that comes up now comes up simply because there was a public fuss about what had happened. Once there's a public debate, and these letters, for example, of Galileo become known, especially the letter to the Grand Duchess of Tuscany. It's not meant to be a secret. Then you get involved in the picture. And in terms of outside influences, first of all, because of the Protestant emphasis upon Scripture and the Catholic Church's really neglecting or being even contemptuous of Scripture, there is this outside pressure which makes you more concerned about making it clear that you're not neglecting what Scripture says, that you're concerned about what Scripture says. And although there is a development of humanism in the 1600s and then the 1700s, which is going to be much more concerned about a variety of ways of approaching texts, one of the central themes of the humanists to begin with had been to take the literal text seriously. And so there was on the humanist side, although there are humanists who are going to become more and more sophisticated, shall we say, in this regard, there is a humanist pressure to take the literal text very, very seriously. And then you've also got building up right at this time. We're just at the time of the first stage of the Galileo case. We're at the build up for what's going to be the granddaddy of the religious wars, which is the 30 Years' War. And with the 30 Years' War coming up, the whole question of the religious issue and making clear your position as being the defender of the true faith is going to be a factor that, for example, Pope Urban VIII in the second stage of the Galileo case is going to have to take very, very seriously, because when he becomes Pope in 1623, the war is going on, and very much in a way that's favorable to the Catholic side of the picture, down to 1629, when Gustavus Adolphus comes onto the scene, or 1630 when he comes onto the scene. And then the early 1630s, with the Protestants starting to get the edge again, this question of the true defender of the faith is a factor that has to be taken seriously. And once more, the Protestants are very keen. Not all of them, but the bulk of them are very keen on trying to demonstrate that the church is an enemy of Scripture. Also, there's a kind of parallel battle going on, not about, in a way, it can involve a spirit which is similar to the battle that involves Galileo. But in the Dutch world, there's this battle between the very, very strict Calvinists and then the others who are more open to questions involving free will and the influence of free will, the Arminians. And this is a very, very serious debate that is of concern up there. And people at the time, some of the people at the time saw a parallel about it, about the concern of the forces that represent the Orthodox world to make sure that it's clear that they're doing what they ought to do. So that's what's there from the outside, really.
So I guess we get, go ahead.
And the magical cosmological influence that you want to demonstrate that you're not falling prey to.
Sure. So I guess we'll get into some of the aspects of the case. Excuse me. So Galileo is publishing some of these findings, and it comes to the attention, if I'm not mistaken, of Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, Saint Robert Bellarmine.
Right.
And I have a quote from him that seems interesting. He says, interpreting heliocentrism as a physically real thing would be a very dangerous thing, quote, likely not only to irritate all scholastic philosophers and theologians, so it's going to go against what was widely held at the time,
right,
but also to harm the holy faith by rendering holy scripture as false. So he's basically saying these scientific discoveries that you're making, it's basically going to make holy scripture false. Or if you publish this, it's going to make people think that holy scripture is false. It seems to be this kind of conflation, this mix of faith and science, and he's saying this is going to be a problem. How do we defend what St. Robert Bellarmine said there?
Well, I mean, that's not the only thing that Robert Bellarmine said. Now, he's the inquisitor in charge of the thing, but he also, his concern was, once again, that it is not the case in 1615, 1616, that the learned world in general, including the world that Galileo is part of, the mathematical world, is in agreement about whether or not there is a proof for heliocentrism. Among the people who are even in favor of heliocentrism, a good number of them are aware of the fact that they don't have a definitive proof of it. And Bellarmine's whole approach all the time, in ways which I think we're going to have to come back to, perhaps to summarize the long-term problems here as well. Bellarmine is concerned with, has a holistic vision of learning. And he's concerned about the impact of theories on other disciplines of learning of all kinds, and is unwilling to overturn what it is that are the pillars of other disciplines for the sake of accommodating what could be an enthusiastic acceptance of something which will in the long run prove not to be correct. But he also says that he makes it clear that his concern is for Galileo to talk about the Copernican theory as a hypothesis, as a theory, and not as a proven fact. That's his chief concern. And he brings up a number of the arguments that are problems, including one which I think has a long-term consequence as well, that is very, very clear when you consider the way in which science is going to develop as an ideology that in our own day has worked to destroy science rather than to perfect it. And that is that once again, you're talking, because Galileo is very keen on experimentation and observation, and that's what the work he did with Pisa, with dropping the weights and all of the rest. And Bellarmine, just makes the obvious point that from the standpoint of any human being observing what's happening around him, you look up in the morning and it looks like the sun is moving around you. So the thing is, if the hypothesis says the opposite, you have to come up with absolutely clear proofs that save the appearances of things. You got to make it. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is the wise man is going to look like a witch doctor, because what you observe is not what's real. And if that happens, then what can go what can take place is it can feed all of the cosmological theories of the magicians, who you're very much dealing with at this time period. Every ruler in Europe has got a court astrologer and a court magician, from the Queen of England to the Holy Roman Emperor, and others. And you had just in 1600 had to deal with Giordano Bruno, who is, I think, the only man that the Roman Inquisition actually put to death, certainly by burning. And that's because he used the Copernican theories, but he plugged them into a whole occult, esoteric, magical set of speculations as well. And you don't want the mathematician, astronomer, to end up being associated with a kind of esoteric knowledge that is not accessible to ordinary people. That's another one of the difficulties here. But Bellarmine also says, and he says it in writing, he says if in the long run there are proofs of the heliocentric vision of things that prove to be accurate, he said, then what's going to happen is we're going to have to sort out how to explain what it was that people said about this matter in Scripture. But he said it's going to have to be a careful discussion that's going to take time and thought in order to be able to deal with. All right, so he kind of admits one of the points of Galileo. He kind of admits one of the points of Galileo, but says we're not in this position any longer, at this point at all. And if you look at for example, it's still a debate among Catholics, because there are Catholics who are perfectly willing to accept the argument of Bellarmine and then of Galileo with regard to this scriptural reinterpretation. And there's other Catholics who don't. Obviously, the Church, the official Church, has gone so far as I think it's the first of John Paul II's apologies was with regard to decision in the Galileo case. And in the manner that he's made that apology, by the way, would have the same kind of lack of infallibility about it as did the decision of the Inquisition, which was made not really in this first stage of discussions of Galileo and Bellarmine, but after Galileo demonstrated that he didn't really want to accept the Copernican idea as a hypothesis, and then tried to debate with the Inquisition, and then the Inquisition got irritated with him, so they issued this decree saying that part of what was being said here was absurd and against common sense, and the other part of it was against the accepted teaching on Scripture. But the weight, on the basis of infallibility of a decision of a congregation or of a statement of the Pope, the way that he made it is not an infallible statement one way or the other, So to kind of recap what Bellarmine is saying here, and on behalf of the Catholic Church, they're saying, so the current interpretation of Scripture is that the earth is at the center of the universe. That is how we interpret Scripture right now. Galileo, right. You have found this stuff. It may turn out to be true, but careful, hold on. We're going to need to recap, and we're going to need to regroup from a theology standpoint and understand and figure out, does this actually contradict or not? So Bellarmine is basically saying, put the brakes on what you're saying. Don't distribute it widely, because this is going to damage the faith of people. The church needs to figure this stuff out as well. If it turns out to be true, that's fine, but we're going to need to, figure things out kind of simultaneously instead of all of a sudden a scientific or astronomical point of view coming out first that's going to damage people's faith. Yeah, and again, one has to keep in mind the fact that it's not as though there is this tidal wave of acceptance of the proofs and the argument as a whole that you're just putting your finger in the dike of. There really is a lot of debate. I mentioned that debate at the Roman College. It seems to be the case that the Jesuits at the Roman College believed the heliocentric argument, but they didn't believe the proofs. They didn't believe the proofs, and as a consequence, they thought it was a suitable conjecture, that looked as though it was true, but you had to wait till you have the proofs for it. And the thing is that if you rush into something like this and then it proves to be wrong, then you're going to have egg on your face the other direction. And then also there is the case of the long-term consequences of talking about these matters that might alter the scientists' view. And of course, we've had in the 20th century explanations about this whole thing that even argue that it doesn't matter from a scientific standpoint, from a standpoint of measurements and all the rest. It doesn't even matter whether you have the geocentric or the heliocentric view scientifically to explain distances and so on and so forth. But what it does do is it has the long-term impact of dethroning what happens on the earth and what happens to human beings from being at the center of things in a psychological way that also is something which is extremely important for understanding the whole picture of what man is and what the universe is as a whole. And I can't remember, we may have in a previous discussion brought up this fact that the whole of the scientific revolution as it's developing on the basis of observation and experiment and the like is working together with the idea that all of this is going to be something of value for enhancing the life of human beings and the dignity of man. But in the long term, what happens with the dethroning of man and what happens to man at the center of the earth is it kind of destroys any sense of meaning to why human beings should be alive at all in such a way as to really destroy the argument for why you should bother to rationally understand how to use the things of nature for anything other than for any purpose that would be of rational use to human beings, and hence the primitivism that we're experiencing today. I mean, man has been dethroned, the dignity of man has been destroyed. The dethroning of man has now led to the argument that there is no such thing as nature and there is no such thing as natural law. And therefore, the whole end of the scientific revolution, with its dethroning of the earth and man at the center of things psychologically, aside from the teaching of the church about these matters, the whole effect of it has been to destroy reason and science along with everything else. So that's a long-term consequence that you have to be concerned about. So it's more the decree of the decree against Copernicus that comes out in this first stage of the Galileo issue. First of all, it doesn't mention Galileo at all. It doesn't mention him at all. And there's also certain oddities, there always are oddities about the question of the decree and the actual wording and so on and so forth. But all it is, insofar as it involves Galileo, is a warning to not deal with this as something which is accepted. Yes, the language against the theory is pretty clear in the decree, but in the practical effect in terms of what it means for Galileo's work is it doesn't really disturb his work one bit. And in fact, Galileo has the letter from Bellarmine, which indicates that it's just a warning. It's just a warning that involves prudence until the whole matter can be corrected, I think is the language, donec corregatur. But it is anti-Copernicus. But as with many of these Roman decrees, there's always these loopholes within them. I'm thinking in the 20th century, with the condemnation of the Action Française, one of the things that the decree said was that the faithful were not permitted to read the daily newspaper, which was called the Action Française. They were not permitted to read that, and some people went down to Rome to complain about this at the Holy Office, and they were told, well, that decree means just don't read it that much. That kind of thing. And Galilei just goes back and continues with his work. But that's where, the next stage of the difficulty comes onto the scene.
Sure. So in the next stage, am I getting my facts right, where he was basically told that he was put under house arrest and said, stop publishing stuff? Was that when this came about, or?
We're talking, the decree comes out in 1616, I believe. Let me just check the exact date again. The first one. 1616. But what happens is the next stage of the game is not going to develop until much, much later, because Galilei goes back to work. He has more controversies with people. Just trying to see if I can get some of the exact. I don't want to get the dates wrong here again. He has another, one of these fights. I think it's fight over the comets. Question of comets comes in here in the meantime. But then what ends up happening is that one of the cardinals who had been against the condemnation, right, Cardinal Barberini, is elected Pope in 1623 as Pope Urban VIII. So Barberini, Bellarmine was friendly to Galileo. Barberini was even more friendly to Galileo. So Galileo gets excited that now what might happen is that he would be able to, with this friendly Pope, have the decree against the Copernican theory overturned. All right, he wanted to have it overturned. So what he did is he wrote another book, and I think this is the one called Il Saggiatore. He writes another book about the whole question and dedicates it to Urban VIII. And Urban VIII he's friendly, but he doesn't want to get involved. And again, one of the reasons why he doesn't want to get involved is because of the fact that the 30 Years' War is going along. You got this whole outside issue, this question of in this case, saving the appearance of treating Scripture seriously as well, which is very important. And Galileo is peeved. Galileo is really peeved. Now Galileo, not in all of his writings, practically, Galileo is he's acerbic. He's not somebody who just wants to convince you, wants to destroy you if you're an enemy. I have a citation here. Let me see if I can find this quickly. It's a famous one, I think. I don't
know what you're talking about, Dr. Rao. Intellectuals are never acerbic about their views. Come on.
No, there's one writer. This is a long time ago in a book called Martyrs of Science. He says this: the boldness, may we not say the recklessness, with which Galileo insisted on making proselytes of his enemies served but to alienate them from the truth. In other words, you got to be on his side. If not, he destroys you, and it's an unpleasant feature. And he can't keep his mouth shut. He doesn't seem to have any sense of prudence in this regard. It's funny because if I'm lecturing and I'm not attacking somebody who's alive around me or whatever, but dealing with things historically, I like to dot the I's and cross the T's on the argument, but I don't like face-to-face polemics with individuals in which you sort of trying to make a point rather than really serve the cause of the truth. And the result of a lot of this is that at times, if there's, like, say, a general attack on people on our side, with regard to an issue, by name, all sorts of people that I know will be attacked, and my name gets left out. And the reason is because I'm not really I don't like to make nasty comments about living people. So as a result of that, maybe it's a cowardice on my part in that regard. But Galileo likes to he does go on the attack. So he writes another book because he says, I got to make the argument more clear still. And he writes this famous work of his on the great systems, the two systems of the world, in which what he's going to do is he's going to pit the heliocentric argument against the geocentric argument in the form of a debate, with of two people, and he says things in this work, as he says in previous works, which go too far, either on a personal level to irritate people, or even on a scientific or ideological level. I think it's in Il Saggiatore that he says, I may be wrong, but I think it's in Il Saggiatore that he makes this comment. He says, the universe is an open book and mathematics is its language. Well, that means that everything can be known by mathematics. And that's the kind of non-holistic statement that Bellarmine, who by this point is dead, would consider to be dangerous. But in the dialogue that he has there with pitting the two systems against one another, the man who is the representative of the older Aristotelian Ptolemaic view, who's called Simplicio, was seen by people to represent Pope Urban VIII. Now, Pope Urban VIII was an erudite, not scientific figure, a humanist more than anything else, but very friendly to Galileo, and in no way hostile to this theory, except in the kind of Bellarmine sense of taking everything into account and also having pressures on him. So now Urban VIII is irritated. He may himself have thought that Simplicio was he. So the case is dragged before the Inquisition again. All right, let me get the exact date once more because I don't.
Looks like the second one was 1633.
Yeah, it's in the 1630s. 1632, 1633. By the way, at this point, when it's dragged before the Inquisition again, there's other factors that have entered into the picture as well. I mean, Galileo is not the only one talking about heliocentrism and then trying to come up with scriptural theories that would allow for its interpretation, Scripture's interpretation in line with the Copernican view. There's another guy, I think his name is Foscarini, who was, if I'm not mistaken, a Carmelite, but Foscarini would come up with all this. I think he takes the candelabra in the temple and uses this to try to defend the Copernican theory. I mean, you've got all kinds of stuff like that. And then there was an Italian scholar in the 1990s who said, and his theory is still being debated by people, he said that in the discussions of the Inquisition that he had uncovered, that there was more to their concern about Galileo than just the Copernican argument, because they felt that in his physics, in his understanding of things mechanically, that he was playing around with arguments of a sort that would make it impossible for the church to utilize, to continue to utilize Aristotelian arguments as it had baptized in using these to describe what happens with the Eucharist, with transubstantiation, right? Because this is a use of Aristotelian terminology in that regard. And other scholars have debated this and said they don't see it, but it's quite possible, given the fact that a lot of the discussions of the Inquisition are secret, that if there are allusions to this kind of a debate that have come out, that it could well be the case that this is true. I mean, this is the problem that comes up with Descartes. When Descartes divides up things that are of the body and things that are of the spirit, so to speak, then what happens is you just have a mechanism that you're talking about, and it wreaks havoc with your ability to explain the Eucharist with the term transubstantiation. So there's arguments of this sort that come up, but in any case, the calling of Galileo before the Inquisition the second time around was on the basis of disobedience of the command to only use Copernicus, or talk about Copernicus as a hypothesis. All right, and Galileo goes. He's got the statement from Bellarmine, which says that it's just a warning, and that he has to talk about these matters as an hypothesis. And he said, and that's what I did. He said, I just talked about it as an hypothesis. That's why it was a debate. But this was rather, the Inquisition thought this was quite disingenuous, because the debate is of a simpleton against somebody who is the one who's treated as knowing what's what. It's the kind of stuff that later on in the 1600s, the first great popularizer of Spinoza's ideas in the French-speaking world, Pierre Bayle, kind of argument that the thing that he uses in his journal called The Republic of Letters, that you present, you say, oh my gosh, what horrible ideas these people are spreading, namely the ideas he really supports. And then what you do is you present them magnificently. And then you say, how can he say that when the answer is clearly there? And then he presents the orthodox viewpoint in the mind of a simpleton, in the mouth of a simpleton. And so anybody reading it can say, well, the argument he claims that he's opposing is the one he's really in favor of. And Galileo really makes it quite clear which side he's on in this book, so that they ratcheted the argument up against him. And they said it's not just disobedience, it really is very much vehemently smells of heresy now. And what happens is that in 1633, then the case goes once more before the Inquisition. And Galileo is primarily accused of disobedience because of the fact that he's said to have violated the warning that was given to him. Galileo has the warning that in the letter from Bellarmine about it with him. And he says, I was just told to deal with this as an hypothesis. And he said, that's what I did with my book. But this was looked upon by the Inquisition as really, really disingenuous, because all you have to do is look at the way in which he depicts the people who were involved in the dialogue, and you see that the person who's supporting the older system of the world, the older understanding of things, is depicted as a simpleton who is just overwhelmed by the man who's the supporter of the heliocentric view. So they found this to be just too much to accept. Now, there was one other factor that historians debate here about what might have been involved in the case, because the chief figure responsible, I forget his name. Let me just check here with. By the way, there's something like 20 volumes of this French series of the history of the church, which is massive. Wow. But it has an excellent discussion of the Galileo case. But the Maculano, his name was, the commissioner of the Holy Office, had a meeting with Galileo, a secret meeting with Galileo, in which what he wanted to do was to clarify certain matters there. And we don't really know what went on at the secret meeting. But what ended up happening is that Galileo is found guilty of disobedience, and also of being vehemently suspect in the case of a heretical understanding of interpretation of Scripture. And what then happens is he abjures his error. All right, this is another one of the elements that ends into the legend, with the argument that he clenched his teeth once he'd finished doing this and said, "Eppur si muove," but nevertheless, the Earth moves, which is just the first mention you ever get of that is over a century later. It's all part of the myth that's created around him as part of the popularization of the martyrs of science, so to speak. And he's found guilty and then is sentenced to house arrest. All right. Another part of the element, the myth, is that he was tortured and he was blinded. Galileo was slowly going blind and does go blind in 1637, dies in 1642. But he's not in any way physically maltreated, and he lives the same life that he lived in terms of comfort beforehand. The only thing is, it is true he's under house arrest. All right, and then that's where it ends in terms of the whole official involvement of the Holy Office with Galileo. Another part of the myth is that when he died, he was prohibited from being buried in consecrated ground, which is another absurdity. In fact, Urban VIII sent a blessing as he was dying. The only thing that he would not allow is for a monument to be built over his grave, which I think, if I remember right, was put in later. And he's buried in Santa Croce in Florence. But then the whole myth is created afterwards. In this respect, by the way, there's many people who've made the point, but I think Cardinal Newman makes it perhaps most succinctly that when you're talking about this supposed battle to the death between the Roman Church and science, and a science and scientific studies and scientific progress that the Church in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance and really right through to the present has always been deeply involved in. As Cardinal Newman points out, the only case that you can bring up is Galileo. That's it. And the Galileo case is fraught with all of these, problems. I mean, would there have been a Galileo case if Galileo had simply continued to present what he wanted to say as an hypothesis, instead of, in effect, going on a kind of 17th century version of the talk show circuit in order to shove what he was saying down everyone's throat, and in an environment where there was all kinds of debate about these matters? I doubt it. I mean, Copernicus didn't have a problem for 75 years, before this difficulty came up, and it's the only real case that you've got. The only real case that you've got, and if you pit that kind of a battle, insofar as it does involve scientific matters, against the damage that's been done to science in the last 3 years in particular, but prepared for a good long time by the entire ideology of the Enlightenment, which has then utilized the Galileo case to hammer the Catholic Church over the head, it's ridiculously insignificant. I mean, what the so-called world of science, with their ridiculous T-shirts and their signs about science is real and the like, what they have done to tie science together with Gnosticism and with magical ideas and all kinds of alchemical ideas, which are all of them present in this madness that's sponsored by the transhumanist movement, the post-humanist vision, all of the LGBTQ plus X, whatever it is, and the World Economic Forum and Davos. I mean, what the damage that these people have done to science and reason is incalculable. And their whole house of cards is going to fall on top of them, but unfortunately bring down real scientific progress and as I mentioned once before, the dignity of man in general along with it. If you're going to have a battle as to who is in any way responsible for halting progress, I'd stick with the Catholic Church and the one very, very confusing issue involving Galileo any day.
So I guess just to kind of sum up the Galileo case in and of itself, the two main issues that the church had was, this is unproven. You're putting out hypotheses, yeah, it does contradict the faith, the current understanding of scriptural interpretation that we've had up to this point. So be careful, calm down about it. And then he continued on and was like, no, this is proof. I've got to, he was kind of grandstanding about it. And the church was like, stop, we're still working through this. What you're saying can damage souls because it's a hypothesis still. Obviously, we know it's not a hypothesis anymore. He was right. But the church wasn't trying to say, shut up about science. They were trying to say, shut up about these incendiary things that could damage faith. We need to do our work at the same time, and let's work together instead of being at odds with each other.
Right. If he had backed off and just simply continued his scientific work, there wouldn't have been this. But he just could not bring himself to do that. And I think this is one of the long-term problems that has been there in the entire history of the scientific revolution. And that's the tendency, not of the ordinary working scientist who just often is concerned about what goes on in his laboratory in a way which presents a kind of caricature of the egghead that's going about his business. But it's been a long-term problem for the whole scientific revolution that it is wanted to turn itself into an ideology. That it's got to be this, it's got to be only this. And then regardless, to take, for example, another instance of this, and the one that really dots the I's and crosses the T's on it, you can do a lot scientifically through observation and experimentation, and you can hold up your success in doing what you want to do through experiment and through observation and experiment. But you still have this other question: ought you to do what you can do? And if you can do what you say you can do, is that a result of something that is meant to be, or is this just another proof of human sinfulness? And here too, this is like a broken record of mine. I don't remember whether I brought this up in previous episodes, but you've got the summary of the ideology and the dangers of it in Bacon. In his books on the New Atlantis and on the New Organum, where what he does is what does he say knowledge is? He says knowledge is for power. And if knowledge is for power, it means knowledge is not for what both Plato and the whole of the scriptural tradition tells us knowledge is for, which is to know, love, and serve God. That Plato doesn't understand the God of the Christians. Obviously, it was before the Christianity, but he knows that that's what knowledge is for. And if you can use knowledge for power purposes alone, you're using it for something which may well be not part of nature, but of a fallen nature. And a science that does not want to take that into account is a science, once more, that does not want to see the whole picture of human life. That's what Bellarmine is, I think, most concerned about, because you can see this in other work that he does. He's a polemicist, but a polemicist that does not want to destroy his enemies, which is not what Galileo is like. But he's a man that knows that every part of knowledge has its place. And if what you do is you come in there, with a fiery sword and demand that everything give way before your particular type of knowledge, no matter how true that knowledge might be in one narrow realm, if it's not taking into account what the other realms of knowledge are telling you about human life and the universe in general, well, then it's going to bring you down. All right, and that's where the real difficulty has come in with all of this stuff in the course of the century since Galileo.
Was there any change in the way that the Catholic Church viewed science or worked with scientists or any of that sort of thing after the case? Did the church kind of take responsibility and say, yeah, we were wrong in this area, or we were right in this area? Was there any broader impact on the church vis-a-vis science after this?
Well, what tends to happen is more not because of the Galileo case, really, not so much that, but because of the popularizing of Newton, and not just Newton, but the whole school of thought that Newtonian scientists and Newtonian academies like the Royal Academy and the theologians who were connected with this worldview, and then the Whig Anglo-American, political outlook that linked up with it. The influence of that worldview from particularly the 1730s onwards, what it did was it created the vision that if what you did was to follow the path of observation and experiment along the lines that were being presented in particular by Newton and his followers. The theologians who were involved with Newton call themselves physico-theologians. And it's called physico-theology, their whole approach. And basically the modern expression of is creationism. And what they do is they try to argue that because of all of the divisions in the Christian world, the fighting out of whose debates does nothing but feed the cause of the atheists. What we have to do is back away from doctrinal discussions and back away from doctrinal disputes, and then look to the observation of nature and experimentation with nature to develop all of the laws of nature. And through the laws of nature and the harmony of the laws of nature, what you can see is that there has been a nature put together in a harmonious mechanical fashion that indicates an architect. All right. And the architect is the creator God. And this view was looked upon in the Catholic world, as well as in much of the Protestant world, as the best way to move ahead, to not allow the atheists to exploit Christian divisions. And so you have a lot of Catholic bishops and popes and religious and others saying, back away from all of the disputes. I mean, Galileo was involved in theoretical arguments. Mathematics, the universe is an open book, and math is its language. Back away from all of those disputes, because those disputes are also divisive. Whereas if we all unite in just exploiting the laws of nature, we'll see it's too harmonious to have had anything other than a creator, God, behind it. And the whole scientific revolution then, in effect, is taught as though you can go down that pathway with no difficulties whatsoever, while at the same time keeping your Catholic doctrine, but not making a big fuss out of talking about it and defending it, and missing what people then did see when you get into the period of the revolution and then the 19th century, which is that this experimentation, observation-based science that backs away from theoretical discussions of things may very well give you arguments for indicating that there is a creator behind the universe, but it doesn't give you the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It doesn't give you the Trinity. It gives you deism. There's a God, right, but that's it. That's all there is to it. And that argument, pumped into the way in which the whole physico-theological argument was devised, is just a way station ultimately to pure immanentism, pantheism. Because, for example, Newton said that everything was harmonious, but there were nevertheless inexplicable footprints of the creator God in nature that could not be explained, of which the most important was gravity, the attraction, of gravity. And Spinoza, the atheist, had already indicated that the mere fact that you can't explain aspects of nature now doesn't mean that you won't be able to explain them later. So that people of the next generation of Enlightenment thinkers who heard the arguments of the physico-theologians, I'm thinking right now, for example, of I think it's Gibbons, the historian of the fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbons said, when I heard the arguments of the physico-theologians, he said, I lost my Christianity and became a deist. And then others said, and then I went from my deism to my atheism and said, science will explain everything eventually. So the church just church men kind of fell into just accepting the fact that, we've got our Catholic faith. We don't talk about it much. We just go ahead with doing what we do scientifically. And I think that, to a large degree, many Catholics continue to have this kind of worldview. They don't want to have debates about doctrine and about God or whatever. Your God is fine, my God is fine, that kind of thing. And we'll just, we'll just in effect live in two different kinds of worlds. The one world of the daily practice that we live in is run by scientific ideas. And then on Sunday, we go to our own particular church and pray a little bit, but they don't really, get confused with one another. I don't like this apology business that began with John Paul II. With Galileo, I think, is the first of his apologies, because again, it just takes everything out of the context and makes it seem like there was a one-sided issue here. Here too, I want to bring up Benedict XVI once more, because Benedict XVI was not a scientist, and in my mind, he talked a bit too much about without criticizing the scientific problems behind it, about all of this climate change business. He talked too much about that, but he was aware that it was plunked into a religion of ecology. And he says that religion of ecology, gave a number of speeches on this to learned audiences. He said it's plugged into a religion of ecology, which misses the whole understanding of a human being. And he said, if you want to talk about ecology, you have to talk about human ecology. And he said, and the human ecology would recognize that a purely naturalist ecology that doesn't take into account the possible errors of your own science, but then also the entire picture of what nature is there for, flips everything around and then makes human beings simply the servant of an unthinking, irrational, purposeless nature, to which everything, including human life, has to be sacrificed. And that's the broader Bellarmine understanding of things. Because again, nobody has apologized on the other side of the picture for anything that they have ever done. And what has been done by the enemies of faith through the past 5 centuries has been horrendous. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's what things are. For a lot of people, I think in the Catholic Church, you just don't bother to talk about these matters. Or nowadays, I mean, people are just either reacting against everything in a way that it might make them skeptical of the value of science as a whole in any regard. That's always a possibility. Or they're reacting by just simply dropping huge chunks of what would have been considered not faith and doctrinal matters, but rational and common sense deductions about the meaning of things, as, for example, with regard to the relation of the sexes. If you had told people 100 years ago that the scientific world would be justifying believing that you could not define what a woman was, I mean, they would have thought that you were talking madness. And yet that's the reality today.
Yeah, that's the lesson to be learned, is that science without a broader understanding of the purpose for science, the purpose for human beings existing is going to get to the wrong conclusions real fast.
Absolutely. And we see it. We see it everywhere around us now. We see it everywhere around us.
Yeah. Dr. Rao, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. I know you've got a flight to catch a little bit later on this afternoon, so I'm not going to keep you any longer. But for these last 5-6 episodes, thank you so much for all the time you put in preparing these for us. It's been great.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Apologetics Series on the SSPX Podcast and on our YouTube page. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube account and the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. And please consider leaving a rating or a review on this podcast. This will help to make sure more people can find this podcast and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and God bless you.